Hi, and welcome to the Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Nathan Levering.
Exodus chapter 3 is where we find ourselves in the story of God. We are in the third of, God willing, 8 messages where we'll walk through the story of God together. Many of us are in life groups, and as we gather life groups, we're watching Pastor Greg from Mariners talk to us about some of the key ways that the story of God moves towards Jesus. And I'm thrilled with where our small groups will be going this week because I think his message is fantastic. Where we find ourselves then, as many of you know, in the story of what God is doing in human history is just a few kind of chapters past God stepping into creation and from nothing creating. He creates a creation that he loves. He creates a creation that he gives purpose to. And part of that purpose to be in relationship with him, and like we all know, any real relationship is a relationship where both people choose to be in that relationship. They're not forced to be in that, but they have a sort of will of their own. Well, in the story of God, only a couple chapters in, a serpent shows up and plays on that will that God has given his creation, made in his image. And as a result of sort of believing what the serpent has to say over the truth of what God's revealed, we rebel. Rather be God than worship God. And as a part of that rebellion, we sort of enter this second phase, only 3 chapters into the story, what we call the fall. And now from about that 3rd chapter to around the 11th in the book of Genesis, the beginning, we find this sort of unraveling of the human race. And it's at that point in chapter 12 where God steps in, we talked about this last week, and he calls a man out of a particular family named Abraham. He says, I'm going to do something unique in time and space, and eventually through your family, he's like, I don't even have a son yet, so a family would be great. Eventually through your family, I am going to turn the tables on that which had been done in the garden. Abraham's like, I'm good with that, but where's my son? Eventually, God gives him a son by the name of Isaac, who has a son by the name of Jacob, who has a son by the name of Joseph. And many of you know his story. It takes up the bulk of the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph's story, in short, is that his brother sell him. He ends up, by God's providence, in the Pharaoh's home in Egypt. A massive famine comes. His family's out of food. But because God continues to walk with and be present with Joseph, he actually provides a way whereby his family can be provided for and protected throughout this time. And so they eventually move down to Egypt. They're doing this whole be fruitful and multiply thing like crazy. There's kids all over the place. A new king replaces the old Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. And the Israelites soon become slaves for. If you're working through your little hand diagram that we looked at last week, Abraham here, we have about 400 years of slavery. It's into this place of slavery where God steps in with the person of Moses and says, I'm going to do something about the misery that I see my children enduring. Well, in the story of Moses, lots of us know the details, so I'll go through a bit of it real quickly. But Moses is a Hebrew, and he comes into the story at a time where, like I said, there's Hebrews that are beginning to outnumber the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians step in and they say, hey, we got to push pause on all these babies that are being born. So how about we throw all the male children into the Nile? Well, the point was to kill all those children. Moses eventually gets thrown into the Nile in the protection of his mom, and he's raised in Pharaoh's household actually as a Hebrew. And one day Moses comes out, a child who's born and raised with all the privilege and protection that God had for him, and he sees out on the horizon an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And it stirs something in him. This incredible passion which turns to rage, and he steps in and he goes so far as to kill the Egyptian and bury him in the sand. Next day or days, he goes out and he sees 2 Hebrews fighting with each other. And he's like, hey, wait a second. Like, I get were under the rule of the Egyptians. I get that fighting, but why are you fighting with each other? And one of them looks back at Moses and he says, hey, this is none of your business, Moses. Oh, Moses, born and raised in privilege. He says, what are you going to do, kill us like you did the Egyptian? And Moses sort of goes through in the story this kind of identity and passion crisis, and I don't really know why I'm here. And he eventually flees out into the desert for some 40 or so years, where he really establishes a life that we might call fine. I mean, things aren't bad. Things are fine. God steps in to his fine. And he says, Moses, there's some people that are really, really struggling. And I want us to do something about it. I mean, this is the story of the scriptures in so many ways. And when we get to the church in a few weeks, God crystallizes the way he works in and through his people by stirring in people like us to find people struggling and do something about it. It's who we are. It's part and parcel to the story. So God shows up into Moses' fine with these words. And if you have your Bible open, we'll read together starting in verse 2 of chapter 3 in Moses. Again, a story you're familiar with. I want to pull a few things out that I think will be helpful for us as we learn to practice the presence of God in our lives. So, verse 2, chapter 3. Here we go. This is what happens when God comes into the story. There, an angel of the Lord appeared to him. This is Moses. He's in the desert. There, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. This is the burning bush story. Moses saw, we would all be a little interested here, that the bush that was on fire did not burn up. So Moses thought, as we would, I'm going to turn aside, literally, and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside, that he had come over, God called out to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, Moses said. She's probably thinking, good. Then he eventually goes on, take off your sandals, Moses, for the place where you're standing is holy ground, not because of the sand that was there, but because God was present. Then he said, I am the God, the literal word there is Elohim. I am the God, the sovereign God of your father. I am the Elohim, the sovereign God of Abraham. I'm the one in charge. I'm the one who started the story. I'm the one that's going to end the story. I'm the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses, not knowing who this God was, hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. God steps in and he says, I've got a purpose for you, Moses. I want you to go from this desert. I want you to leave your sort of fineness and go sort of rattle the doors of Pharaoh and tell him, let your entire workforce go. It's time. I'm coming to get my people. Moses does what many of us do when God calls us into places we're not all that sure about, and he starts making excuses, right? Some of us know the story. I'm not the right guy. I'm this, I'm that. Maybe you should pick somebody else. Each time God steps in and doesn't say, hey, here's how it's all going to go. Hey, let me give you, just watch this, short series of videos, and this is what you have to look forward to, Moses. He says, no. He says, I want you to go, Moses, and I want you to know this. My presence will be with you. I'll go with you. I will be with you. Moses then eventually, as we look down into the story a bit further, look at verse 13. Moses says these words. These are classic words. This is about the second time God has said, oh, please just go, Moses. Let me be God. Let you be Moses. But Moses is still trying to figure this out. And so in verse 13, he says what? Suppose I actually go. I'm not God. I'm not sure. I'm not committing to this yet. I'm not signing up, but I'm considering at this point, God, doing what you've clearly asked me to do. So suppose I actually go. He says, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? This is a question that Moses does not know the answer to. Then what shall I tell them? What should I say? And he sort of like looks at God and he says, God, I think I understand what you're asking me to do. But here's what I need to know. Who are you? Like, can I trust you? Who's going to have our back when the thing starts coming off the rails? When we're not sure where to go? Where this thing starts to play out in ways that we didn't sign up for? And he says to God, can you tell me who you are? And then in verse 14, God says to Moses these words, I am who I am. This is what you're to say. These are the words. This is what you tell them about who I am. Say this to the Israelites. I am has been sent to you. And then verse 15, God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, this is Yahweh, the word we just sang. Say to the Israelites that Yahweh, the Elohim, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. I am the one that is sending you. This is my name forever, God says. The name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation to generation to today. He says these three incredible things. He leans into Moses when Moses says, who are you? He leans into Moses when Moses says, I'm not sure we can trust you. He leans into Moses when Moses says, I see what you want me to do, but it just seems complicated. Who are you? Who is this one who promises to be present with me in the story? And God says this, he says, I'm Elohim. You can know me as Elohim. Elohim is a word for God that simply means he is the sovereign one. He is the one in charge of the story. He is the author of the bigger story. He's the one who kicked off the story. He's the one who will conclude the story. And God leans into Moses. He says, you can know this about me. I'm sovereign. And I will work my plans into your mess. And then the second thing he says, tell them Yahweh. Tell them it's Yahweh that's going to be with them. And the literal description of what Yahweh means when God steps in and he says the Lord, if you have it in your Bible, it's probably capital letters. And it's this idea that God says, not only am I the author, sovereign over the story, I have actually written myself into the story. I am present with you. I am the compassionate one who steps in. I'm the one that meets you in your hardship. I'm the one that'll be there when you're sick or when those that you care about, when you're rattled in the dark nights. I am Yahweh, he says, and I'll be there with you. But then what's fascinating on top of that is that God leans in and he says, tell them I am has sent me. So we might say, like, what is that? And lots of people have wrestled with that. It actually caused me to read a book. I swear, when I put it on the shelf, I would never read it again, about the names of God. And it was fascinating to read through this. And what the author unravels is this idea that I am is actually the verb tense to Yahweh. So the idea is this, that God is the sovereign God as Elohim. He is the God that is present with us as Yahweh and as I am. He is the God that hasn't simply written love into the story, but he acts within the story. It's the verb tense of God. And when he says, I'm coming to get you, Israelites, I'm going to meet you, Nate, in the middle of that chaos, what he's saying is, I am. I'm not just going to be present with you. I will act, because I am a God of action. And so lean in and trust me. Walk with me. The book that I was sort of mentioning in short was written by this guy, Sigmund, and he says these words. He says, to the Hebrew, to be, this word we translate as I am, does not simply mean to exist, as great as that is to know that God exists, but to be active, to express oneself in active being. This is who God is. He is I am. This fascinating story takes place, if you're doing the story of God's redemption on your hand, some 1,500 years after Moses walked the face of the earth, another Israelite showed up in the name of Jesus. And when Jesus showed up, there's multiple scenes in his life where he gets the religious folk folk like me, all stirred up. And John chapter 8 is like one of these mega stories where there's all kinds of argument about all kinds of things. And Jesus kind of, the way he does it, because he's kind of got a little more going on than these guys, is kind of has these religious leaders sort of chasing their tails. And they're trying to figure out, like, who is he and how? And Jesus is claiming a kind of authority that, like, just doesn't smell right to these religious leaders. In fact, to the point where they start to pick up stones because they think this guy's actually claiming to be God. This is blasphemy. There's another point where they're wrestling over some things and Jesus has them kind of going in circles and, they kind of burst out of this confusion and like do their best to put him down. They say, you're just one of those half-breed Samaritans that's demon possessed. What's fascinating is John has a line in here between this battle between Jesus and these religious leaders. And he says this, and many who heard these things put their faith in Jesus. I just think that's fascinating, but it has nothing to do with where we're going today. But it's amazing because people are coming to faith in Jesus and Jesus is battling with these guys. And he kind of comes to this point where they're like, tell us where you think you get your authority. And Jesus says, my authority comes from the Father. And the Hebrew leaders, they're like, hey, we got him now because we're Israelites too. And that's sort of the trump card. And so they say, we don't know who your father is. We don't really care. We are children of Abraham. It's like, okay, now we can finally shut this guy up because we're Abraham's kids. And Jesus in this moment leans into them. And he says, yeah, kinda. You're not acting like Abraham's children. Which of course gets them like infuriated even more. And he's like, how do you know? How do you know we're not acting like Abraham? And Jesus says this, he says, because I know Abraham. And I mean, if you read the story, they're like, wait, what? You're like 30 years old. How do you know Abraham? What are you talking about? And Jesus is like, no, I know Abraham. In fact, before I came, he left a message for you. And they're like, we don't know what he's talking about. And here's the message that Abraham has for you. Pay attention. Pay attention. That was something else. I don't know what that came from, but Brad's fallen asleep. He's heard this sermon before already. So Jesus leans in and he says this. He says, pay attention. When this guy Jesus shows up, you guys should pay attention. Because, and then Jesus goes here with his sword, so I'm going to say, very truly, as Jesus leans in, he says, I want to tell you this. Before Abraham was even born, what does Jesus say? I am. This is who I am. If we read John's gospel over and over, he wants us to know that when we experience God with flesh on in the person of Jesus, that this is the I am that called to Moses out of a bush. He's the one who acts in the middle of our story. And so John, if you read his gospel, brings us 7 times to these I am statements of Jesus. And this is what they sound like. Jesus says this throughout the Gospel of John. He says, I am the bread of life. And then he turns bread and fish and feeds thousands. He says, I'm the light of the world. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the true vine. I am the door. And what he's saying there is like Hebrew or Gentile, I am the way into adoption to the family of God. As important as Abraham is, I am the door, Jesus says. He says, I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life, Jesus would say, for the sheep. And then this amazing story in John chapter 11. And it's a story of Jesus and Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And the story is amazing. And Jesus, at one point in the story, kind of comes onto the scene, and he's greeted by Mary and Martha. And the reason he's greeted quite passionately by them is they'd called him a few days earlier when Lazarus was sick. Because at that point, they believed that Jesus could do something about what he was suffering from. Jesus stayed where he was at, let Lazarus die. And so Mary and Martha, rightfully so, have some words for Jesus. Like, where were you? And it's in that moment that Jesus meets Martha, and it's as if he puts his arm around her and says, I want to show you something that unless these events had happened, you wouldn't see. And so with her, he using her brother as this incredible object lesson, says then these words in John chapter 11, verse 25. He says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. This, as the story goes on, is a little kind of annoying to Martha. She's like, I know that, but I wanted you to save my brother. Jesus is like, we'll get there. Jesus then says these words to Martha as he leans in. The one who believes in me will live. I'm the resurrection. I am the life. I hold these things. I am. Even though they die, whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And what he says is if you put your faith in me, if you believe in me, I change you from the inside out. I reorientate you before God. In fact, this thing called belief is putting your belief in Jesus. You actually experience this full forgiveness by the grace that comes to us in the cross of Christ. We're forgiven of everything we've ever done, what we thought, what we said, and anything we will. It's a complete forgiveness. He fills us with the Spirit of God. He begins to walk with us and guide us in these days. He's present in and with our stories. And Jesus leans into Martha, and he leans into us this morning, and he asks a question. Do you believe? Do you believe that I am this person? Do you believe? John wants us to know this is who he is. Jesus, over and over, I am. This is who I am. I act in human history. I'm here to alter your story, whereby one day when the bookend comes up, you experience this very physical death. It'll be the spiritual death that I've won for you on the cross that will win the day. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus says, do you believe this? And so we ask ourselves, what does it look like to know this Elohim God, the God of the sovereign story, the bookends? What does it mean to know that God is present with us in the midst of our story, the ups and the downs? And what does it mean to live with a level of trust that God isn't just in charge of the big story, as great as that is, he isn't just present with us in our lives, he acts as the God who is. He's active in our lives. We want to spend some time this morning kind of sharing some stories, some real life. Here's how God sort of showed up in our stories. And I was thinking about how God showed up in our story, and there's a number of places. And many of you guys have heard at least bits and pieces of our cancer journey. That at one of our cancer journeys. But at 6 months, Kathy and I were just married. You know, we had the entire world in front of us, and we're getting ready to, who knows, go serve God wherever he wanted us. And I found out after being sick for a little while that I was actually dying of Hodgkin's disease. And so that got me down to Stanford, best doctors in the world, surrounded by teams of doctors. They took a look at what was going on inside of me. And so they sat down this young couple, 6 months, married, and they said, okay, we've got a pretty good look at what's going on inside of you, and it's really severe, and we just want to tell you this, because this might shape how we enter this season, that based on what we're seeing inside your body, you will never have your own biological children. And I know lots of us battle with infertility and these kinds of things, but man, as the one who was sort of the cause to my wife potentially not getting to ever have her own kids, to never having my own children. I mean, it's all that stuff just, you know, it's a dark place. It's tough, it's challenging. As I said, first service, my wife just loved me and us in that moment. And we kind of just said, yeah, we need to remember that this isn't simply our story. It's God's story. And we don't know. And they said, but if you let us run a couple more tests, we can better determine what things look like. And so we let them run those tests, and we gathered back with them. And so they said, yeah, we know that we told you that you would never be able to have your own biological kids. We've run these tests. It's actually worse than we originally thought. And so I was like, well, I don't know how it gets worse from not being able to have your own biological kids. Like, that's sort of the bottom. But we kind of walked with that diagnosis, and it was incredibly challenging, as you would know, some of you, because it's part of your own story. And we wrestled, and we loved each other, and we went before the Lord, and we said, God, since this is your story, not our story, what does that mean? How do you want to be present? How are you going to meet us in this? And it was at that point that both Kathy and I looked at each other, and it was kind of one of those weird things that happens, I think, oftentimes between spouses, at least in our marriage it has, where we kind of look at each other and we think, we're thinking the same kind of thing. And it was like, well, what about adoption? It's like, certainly there's lots of kids that need homes and maybe we can step in. Well, and God just planted this seed in our story at that time. 7 years later, we'd spent time in Moscow, Russia. Life was all over the place. We're currently back here. And Kathy and I look at each other and we think, hey, let's at least test these doctors. Maybe we could have our own kids. And I just want to show you a picture of my two biological daughters. And for me, it's just this incredibly bold and beautiful reminder that this is who God is. It's his story, not our story. And yet when our girls were about 15 and 12, we kind of were like, maybe God's not done writing his story in us. What might this look like? And we just sort of began to plant back into our hearts and go back to what God had been writing all along. And we're out on a bike ride, literally up in the mountains, and Kathy and I looked at each other and I said, babe, God's stirring something in me. What about adoption? Remember when we talked about that? And she looked back at me and she's like, yeah, I think God's put that on my heart too, but I think he's asking us to adopt too. And that's when I took a different trail. I'm like, wrong story. And yet, here's what happened then a number of years ago, right? And many of you guys know these two little knuckleheads because we're asking you to partner with us in raising them. And this is actually a year after they came into our home. They're like babies, and so far more than we asked for. And yet we looked at our lives like God's reminding us this morning and just simply said, this isn't my story. It's God's story. What do you want to write? What do you want to do? How is your presence going to shape this? And so this is the story we're kind of figuring out how to write, right? It goes to a Levering family of 6, and you just kind of do the thing, and you do with what God has given you, and you celebrate the presence of God. You celebrate the action of God in your life. For Moses, this would mean a whole bunch of things as he and the Israelites learned to practice God's presence in their story. Moses would go in, eventually let my people go. Pharaoh's like, no, thank you. I'd like to keep them. 10 plagues later, on the night before Pharaoh finally lets the people go on the last plague, the Passover is initiated. And this comes because what God says as he steps in, he says, if any of you were to experience my freedom and deliverance, you need to take the blood of an innocent lamb, first you slaughter the lamb, take the blood, put it over the doorpost. And when the angel of death passes over your home, seeing the blood, it's a sign of your trust in what I will one day do. As we know, fast forward 1,500 years, Jesus on the cross. But he says, I will pass over your home. And certainly that happens. Many die that night. God steps in. He gets a hold of his nation. They actually pillage the Egyptians, run out. It isn't, they're like, woo, God's on our side, but there's also a Red Sea. And then we're starving in the desert. And then the water's really bitter. And it's like somehow we're trying to figure out how to live with this presence of God in the midst of this promise that he's given us and the prize of experiencing all that he has for us. And they walk this out, learning. Eventually God would give them the 10 commandments, which again is this picture of God restoring relationships within the context of a whole lot of sin. And he says, this is how I want you to orientate your life and figure out how to love each other and love me. And so they walk these things out. God says, build me a tabernacle because that's where I'm going to be and that's where I will meet you. And then fast forward, and if you have your Bible, I want you to flip over. I want to invite you to flip over to Exodus chapter 33. This is where we actually pick up that phrase that we looked at as we began. As we see the presence of God shaping every part of their story, as they learn that this isn't just their story. This is God's story. So chapter 33, verse 7, we get a little bit of a picture of what this looked like to practice the presence of God. Now Moses, he would take a tent, he'd pitch it outside the camp some distance away from the noise and clutter and life of camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And what we learn here is that Moses didn't pitch a tent in the middle of all the chaos. He didn't practice the presence of God, while he was standing in line at the grocery store or while he was sort of in between scrolling his Instagram. He set a special place outside the camp where he went to meet with his God. And it's a beautiful story as it continues on because God meets him in that place in incredible and unique ways. In fact, then all the Israelites would go out to this tent and God would meet with them until we pick up the story in verse 11. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks with a friend. Rewind back to who are you, God, just a few months earlier. Verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, you've been telling me, lead these people. Like, I get it. Okay, you're asking me to do this, but you have not let me know with whom you will send me. You've said, I know you by name, Moses. You found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, Moses asks, so that I may know you. Continue to find favor with me. Remember, this nation is your people. And then the Lord replies to Moses' request. He says, my presence will go with you. It's who I am, Moses. I am that God. Verse 15, then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up. In other words, we don't want the promise without the presence. We so long for you to be right in the middle of our lives. We aren't willing to go. We aren't willing to move without you. So they wait, and yet God responds. How will anyone, then Moses says, how will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? And then this fascinating question. What else, Moses asks, will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? It's my presence. It's my presence. It's what's to mark you out as my children, as those that know me. Who is it? And the Lord then leans in and he says, I'm going to go with you. It's not simply our story. It's God's story. I wanted to try and wrap up kind of where I think God's leading us with a bit of a phrase, and this is in your outline as well. Tried to get as many P's as I possibly could into this one phrase, which is easy to do for a guy like me. The presence of God, what we learned from Moses' snapshot here, it both ensures and secures. The purpose of God, the thing we were made for, the thing that stirs us, that wakes us up in the morning, in the tension between the promise and the prize for his people. And so what does it look like to practice God's presence? Well, we know who he is and will always be. And then we walk out. What does it look like? To very much live this life he's given me, but to also understand this isn't simply my life. It's his story. And so let me walk with you. In fact, let me never walk without you. Let me practice your presence in every area, in every ask, and that will be enough.
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to partner with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.